Good morning. Good morning to those that are tuned in to the live streaming, and good morning to those who are in the audience. We're ready to start this morning. We're studying in the 27th chapter of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 27. Jeremiah chapter 27. Beautiful morning. Glad you're in attendance here at Bible class. We will start our class with a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're grateful unto Thee for the blessings we have. Grateful for the measure of health and strength that we have to be able to be assembled here. Pray that Thou would continue to bless us and bless us in our Bible study, and later on bless us in our worship service, and help us in this ensuing week to do that which is right and do good to all, especially those of the household of faith. Pray for guidance and wisdom. Help us to do good in Jesus' name. Amen. Jeremiah chapter 27. We mentioned last week that Jeremiah chapters 26 through, 50. Chapters 26 through 52. Those chapters relate to Jeremiah's events in his life. Specifically, they kind of focus around him. And what he's doing. So in the 27th chapter, we have an interesting, I guess you'd say Jeremiah was using an object lesson, or he was teaching an object lesson. And this object lesson had to do with a yoke. Now a yoke was some kind of a rig that they put on slaves. It was a straight bar with perpendicular pegs on each end, and then they could wrap a cord around that. And the yoke was emblematic of submission. It was emblematic of the idea of someone being in submission to someone else. In other words, it had to do with a slave symbol. It was a symbol of slavery, in other words. Now, in this chapter, apparently what was happening was that there were certain countries in the Judean area, certain countries, and we'll name those countries, that from time to time had been enemies of the Jews, but representatives of those countries seemed to be coming together to meet with the king of Judah. Apparently there was some distrust, there was some civil problem in Babylon, where they had to, where the military and the king had to pay attention to some domestic problems. It's this country is not the only country where there's been domestic issues. Problems in the social order that cause unrest and angst and so forth. So apparently they were having some difficulty there, and these kings in the Judean area, they probably figured, well, this is an ideal time to resist the Babylonian Empire. But the message in chapter 20, first part of chapter 27, the first 11 verses or so, the message is from God: you people are going to be in submission to Babylon. So just accept that. Now, in the book of Daniel is recorded where God makes some pronouncements about world kingdoms. And it was at the time that Nebuchadnezzar was obviously the king of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he had a dream about some colossal image, as we all remember. And it had a head of gold and a silver chest and brass belly, and then legs of iron and mixed with miry clay. Well, God was identifying that the Babylonians were going to be in power, and then later on the Medo-Persians were going to be in power, and then later on the Greeks were going to be in power, and then later on the Romans were going to be in power. And so God had these kingdoms identified, and so God had decreed that Babylon was going to be in charge at this time, in the world community. Well, and Jeremiah's mission was to tell these folks, and I imagine these folks came together to meet with the king of Judah, and they were going to plan some. They were, plan some strategy. I guess you would say they're doing some strategic planning to resist Babylon. Well, Jeremiah says, there's no, you're going to lose because God has orchestrated this. And the best thing for you to do is give up your sovereignty, submit to the Babylonian rule, and the Babylonians will probably just leave you there, but you'll lose your sovereignty. You're no longer going to be a patriot of your country. You're going to be, you have to swear allegiance, so to speak, to Babylon. Well, that's kind of the gist of what is being said here. Now, in the beginning, in verse 27, chapter 27, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah. Now, here there's a kind of a problem. Later on, he's talking about Zedekiah. And the time frame for Jehoiakim to be ruling is wrong. So apparently there's in the King James Version there's a I don't know whether you'd call it a mistake, a clerical, let's just call it a clerical error. And that should be Zedekiah. Now the English Standard Version and the New International Version and a couple other versions don't use the king, don't name Jehoiakim. They just name Zedekiah, which is in the context it should be, because in verse 3 it mentions Zedekiah. So, and Zedekiah, as you know, was the last king of Judah. He was a rotten king, and he continued to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar took him out, and we've talked about that several times. So in the beginning of the reign of, we'll say, Zedekiah, the son of Zedekiah, and he wasn't the direct son of Josiah, came this word unto Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Thus saith the Lord to me. Now, this is interesting. Make thee bonds and yokes, and put upon thy neck. Just put this rig, the symbol of slavery, on your neck. And I described that, what that was probably like. Make thee bonds and yokes, and put them upon your neck, and send them to the king of. Now here were the people that were confederating to, resist Rome, and send them to the king of Edom. Now apparently these people were actually in Judea or someplace in the area of Judea, meeting together, and send them to the king of Edom, which had been a constant enemy of Judah, but now they've got a common interest here. And the king of Moab, and of course the Moabites were always fighting the Jews. And the king of Ammon, and the Ammonites were always fighting the Jews, and the Jews fighting them. And the king of Tyrus, or Tyre, and Zidon, or Sidon, that is in the Mediterranean area. They're out along the coast there, in the western coast, which, now see here it says, which come to Jerusalem. You know, this is an indication they came to Jerusalem, to the king of Judah, and command them. Now, God says to them, to Jeremiah then says, and command them to say unto their masters, you know, this envoy, these various people coming in, they were ambassadors or representatives of those respective governments. Command them to say to their masters, you go back home and say to your masters, thus saith the Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, thus shall ye say unto your masters. You tell your kings, your masters back home, I have made the earth. Now God is giving the big picture here, the big idea. He said, I've made the earth, I've made man, the beasts of the field that are upon the ground, by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it to whom it seemed meet or suitable or right unto me. Now God is saying here, you let the world know, at least these powers that had come together there, you let them know that I am the creator, that I am the determiner of the bounds of the nations, the borders of the nations. I'm in charge of that. And I have, and as such, given that authority that I have, God says, I've determined what? I've determined that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be in charge. Now let's hearken back to the book of Daniel, where Daniel had this dream, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. Daniel interpreted the dream, talked about the world kingdoms that we mentioned a while ago. And I've given all these lands to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So at this point in time, this point in history, this point on the historical, line, I have determined, God says, that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be king. And by the way, God determined that Cyrus is going to be king in the Medo-Persian Empire. Is that right? Remember in our study of Isaiah mentioned here, at least a century before, this guy Cyrus, and it mentions him, Cyrus is going to release the Jews. Think of that. So God had this outline of history, in future history. Or I guess you can't say future history, can you? That's a contradiction. In the future, there are going to be these kingdoms. I have given all of these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field have I given him also. He's just given Nebuchadnezzar a big kingdom, one that was for that area, the worldwide kingdom. And further, Jeremiah pronounces what God has said in verse 7, and all nations shall serve him. Now, all nations shall serve him. Now, let's try to visualize this scene. here's Jeremiah. He's donning this yoke, and he's talking to, national figures. What do you suppose these people thought about this prophet going around with this yoke on his neck? What do you think their attitude was? Most in it.
They probably thought he was nuts.
Yeah, it's kind of a kook. Can you imagine this sort of a demonstration? Now it would get their attention, but as history plays out, he got their attention, but it was certainly short-lived, and they didn't pay attention, even though he got their attention. They didn't pay attention to him because, as it plays out here, they didn't listen to him. They didn't really take to heart what he was saying. But he says there, and it'll come to pass, the nation. Let's go back. And all nations shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until the very time of his land come. Now, that's an interesting deal here. Here we have God saying through Jeremiah, God's saying, Jeremiah's taking the words of God, talking about Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a son and then a grandson, and they're going to rule. So, see, there were prophets in those days that were saying, with this first wave of captives, there were prophets saying, oh, you're going to, within a couple of years, and we'll see this later on in our study, in a couple of years, people are going to come back, and the king and a ruler from the dynasty of David are going to be, back in charge, and you're going to be a sovereign nation. And God, and later on, God mentions it'll be 70 years in bondage. Well, there are going to be three kings. They're going to be Nebuchadnezzar, and then a son, and then a grandson. And then it would be time. Let's notice that language again. All nations shall serve him, and his son's son, until the very time his land come. Something's going to happen to Babylon. Okay? And then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of him. What's that mean? That means that Babylon is going to be, the power of Babylon is going to be taken away. And we go over to the fifth chapter of Daniel. Now, Daniel, as we know, was a Jewish person who served King Nebuchadnezzar. He was chief among rulers under Nebuchadnezzar. And then he served all through that Babylonian period. And he served in the first part of the Medo-Persian domination. In the fifth chapter of Daniel, it talks about Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? God said that they'd be in rule during Nebuchadnezzar, son, and then son's son, grandson. Well, and then somebody else going to be in charge of this area, this landscape in that area. Belshazzar, in chapter 5 of Daniel, Belshazzar, king of the king, now this is that son's son, grandson, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to the thousands of the lords and drank wine before the thousand. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which had his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the, now that father there references should be grandfather. He said, but he ordered the vessels that had been taken out of the temple from Jerusalem, that the kings and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. And they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. That had been 70 years before. Okay? And they drank from them. Excuse me. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and brass and iron and of wood and of stone. So they drank from the very vessels from the house that came from the temple in Jerusalem 70 years prior. And they were, dedicating their, people today, make a toast, that kind of stuff. I don't know why, but that's kind of tradition. Well, they were probably making a toast, A toast to whom? Well, they're gods. They're various gods. And that didn't set well with God. He says, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hands, and wrote over against the candlestick on the plaster of the wall and of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. You can imagine that. And we're all familiar with this story, but it fits in here to refresh us. Over on the wall here, there's the hand writing. Wow. That'd shake them up. The toasting would have stopped. The vessels have been put on the table, so to speak, and they were paying attention to this whole thing. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Now that he was pretty physically shaken up. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, and the king spake and said unto the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have chains of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came all the king's men, the wise men, the astrologers, all those people in verse 9. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed, and him and his lords were anointed. Now, you go on down. The astrologers, the Chaldeans, they didn't know what this was all about. But then the queen remembered about Daniel serving King Nebuchadnezzar. And he was able to interpret dreams and so on. In verse 15 or 13, then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake unto him, Daniel, art thou that Daniel which art the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that the light that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And he says, the wise men his counselors couldn't interpret this. And so the king offers him, Daniel, gifts and so forth. And Daniel says, keep your gifts. Then Daniel answered and said unto the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give reward to another. Yet I read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, that most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar, you see, hearkening back to our story here of Jeremiah, 27th chapter. Here's the idea here is that, God, as Jeremiah said, God's given these kingdoms to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel, here in retrospect, looking back, O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Gave him, he was the head man on earth, so to speak. He was the head man. This idea that the president is the most powerful person in the world. History indicates that throughout history there's somebody has been kind of the dominant figure in the world, in the world economy. Well, this Nebuchadnezzar was the dominant person, and God made it so. And for the majesty that he had given him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he slew, and whom he would be kept alive, and whom he would set up, and whom he would put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and then Daniel mentions about, as we know in the history of Nebuchadnezzar, he was dethroned for a 7-year period and ate was put out to pasture, so to speak, and was lived like an animal. And then he came to his senses and then recognized that God was in charge and that he really wasn't in charge, And then he later in the 5th chapter there, he interprets the dream and says that you're done, you're finished. In that night, that same night, Belshazzar, that's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And that's when the Medo-Persian regime began. So the point is, Jeremiah's point to these people is, you're not going to, God has decreed this. He's decreed the Babylonian dominance. He had his own purposes in mind. And it shall come to pass in verse 8, that the nation and the kingdom which will not serve the same Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and that will not put their neck under the yoke. You see that he was wearing this yoke, and he put your neck under the yoke. Be subservient to the king of Babylon. That nation will I punish. God says, you either serve, your nation either serves Babylon, the king of Babylon, or I will punish. God was going to use them, those Babylonians, the Chaldeans, to punish them. And they're going to be punished with the sword, the famine, and pestilence. Now, those three issues comes up periodically, several times in Jeremiah. People are going to be punished with a sword, military action. They're going to be punished with famine, no food stuff, and pestilence. COVID-19, swine flu, malaria, whatever. There was, think of military action, no food, and then sickness. What a mess they would be in. World of hurt. Therefore, hearken not ye to your prophets, nor to your diviners, nor to your dreamers, nor to your enchanters, nor to your sorcerers, which speak unto you, saying, ye shall not serve the king of Babylon. There were those. Jeremiah was plagued by all of these people that were just saying the opposite. Well, let's suppose you were in a situation where you were in an assembly and the word was being preached, and you had a bunch of people saying, no, that's not good. He's lying. I remember one time several years ago, a preacher was preaching here, and now this is the only time in all of my experience I've ever had. Preacher was preaching, a lady sitting back there, right there in the middle, said, "Hey, you're a false teacher." He just stood up and said, "You're a false teacher. You're lying to these people." Well, we had to say to the lady, "Please sit down and shut up." That wasn't a very good way of saying it, but that's what I said. To shut up. Yeah, she sat down. But then I offended her and she left. I should have handled that differently, preacher. But I was trying to maintain some order here, you see. But let's suppose in every assembly you had, this, you're lying. You're leading he had resistance in every assembly. Or out in the street. Now let's think, do the scriptures have resistance out in the world? You better believe that scriptures are unfortunately in this country now. Scripture is maligned 100 ways from Sunday. Well, Jeremiah says, don't pay any attention to those dudes. Verse 10, for they prophesy a lie unto you, to remove you from your land, that I should drive you out, you should perish. But the nations that bring their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him, those will I let remain still in their own land. Now they're going to lose their sovereignty. They're no longer going to be patriotic to their, but he says they're going to live and avoid the pestilence, the sword, and the famine. But the nations that bring their neck under the yoke, the king of Babylon, and serve him, those will I remain still in their own land, saith the Lord, and they shall till it and dwell therein. They're going to be able to farm. They're going to be able to raise crops. They're going to be able to, continue their existence. Avoid the famine, pestilence, and so on. Verse 12. I spake also unto Zedekiah, king of Judah, according to all these words. So he's speaking to these ambassadors from other countries. And he says, he spoke directly to Zedekiah. Now Zedekiah was just a rotten person, and he paid a severe price for his evil doings. When he was, as we've said before, he escaped Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar brought a campaign against Jerusalem. They caught up with him. And as last week we indicated, that his sons were killed in his sight, his eyes were put out, and then taken away into Babylonian captivity. He says, I spake unto Zedekiah, king of Judah, according to all these words, saying, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him and his people, and live. Why will you die then, thou and thy people, by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence, as the Lord has spoken against the nation that will not serve the king of Babylon? Therefore hearken not unto the words of the prophets that speak unto you, saying, ye shall not serve the king of Babylon, for they prophesy a lie unto you. For I have not sent them, saith the Lord, yet they prophesy a lie in my name, that I might drive you out, that ye might perish, ye and the prophets that prophesy unto you. As I spake unto the prince, the priest, and the people, saying, now also I spake unto the priest and to this people, saying, so he not only spoke to the authorities, but he spoke to the religious people, the priests, and the folks. Thus saith the Lord, hearken not to the words of your prophets that prophesy unto you, saying, behold, the vessels of the Lord's house shall now shortly be brought again from Babylon, and for they prophesy a lie unto you. Now, so there were those that were saying, in fact, Hananiah, we'll read here later on, where Hananiah, a false prophet, said, within 2 years you're going to come back. Well, what was the reality? 70 years. He said, now, these people that were saying, it's just going to come back, and the vessels of the Lord's house would come back. When did the vessels of the Lord's house, or the temple, when did those vessels come back? Under Cyrus. If you count up the vessels where they were brought back, there were over 5,000 vessels brought back. Now that's a lot of vessels, right? Over 5,000, 5,400 brought back from captivity, but it was under Cyrus that they were brought back. Well, these false prophets saying, oh, we're going to get all that stuff back. They looted our temple, but we're going to get it all back. Well, as history plays out, what happened to the temple? Torn down. City burned. And it was only after they were in captivity 70 years that they got these things back, and they were able to rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. So, he's saying, you better not listen to those dudes. Going on here then, for thus saith the Lord of hosts concerning the pillars and concerning the seas. Now, the pillars of the temple, they had these seas, big water vat. Solomon had made water vats, and the Babylonians had carried those things off. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, in verse 19, concerning the pillars and concerning the sea and concerning the bases and concerning the residue of the vessels that remain in this city, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of took not. Now there were some things that he didn't take. I think they were too heavy for him to transport. So there were some things left there. I misspoke there a moment ago. Which Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, took not, when he carried away captive Jeconiah. Now, what was another name for Jeconiah? Jehoiachin. And he was carried away. Jehoiachin, the son of Jehoiakim, was carried away into Babylon, and eventually was treated pretty well by the king of Babylon. Well, reading that verse 20 again, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took not when he carried away captive Jehoiachin, or Jeconiah, as is mentioned here, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from Jerusalem to Babylon, and all the nobles of Judah and Jerusalem. The Bible specifically mentions 10,000 of the artisans, the people that were, skilled in some respects, in various respects. Verse 21, Yea, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, concerning the vessels that would remain in the house of the Lord, and in the house of the king of Judah and of Jerusalem. They shall be carried to Babylon. So all of these things are going to be carried, in fact, were carried to Babylon. And in the book of Ezra, we see those coming back, a record of those coming back. And they shall be carried to Babylon, and they shall be there until the day that I visit them. And we read about God visiting Babylon with Belshazzar, with the handwriting on the wall. And then Belshazzar was killed. The Medo-Persian Empire took over. I will visit them, saith the Lord, then I will bring them up and restore them to this place. So these vessels, the temple furniture, temple vessels, going to be gone for 70 years, going to be brought back at a later time. Well, chapter 28 then talks about, specifically about one of these false prophets. Now, he speaks generically about false prophets. He said, don't listen to him. Now, he's zeroing in on one particular false prophet. And it came to pass the same year, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, so this first part of his reign, in the 4th year and in the 5th month, that Hananiah, the son of Azor, the prophet, which was of Gibeon, spake unto me in the house of the Lord, in the presence of the priest and of all the people, saying. Now, here's this false prophet, Jeremiah, there in the temple area, and he says, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon. Hananiah says, I've broken the yoke. What's that mean? The power. I have taken the power away from Babylon. Now within 2 full years will I bring again unto this place all the vessels of the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took away from this place and carried them to Babylon. So here's this false prophet saying, 2 years from now, everything's going to be back to normal. Judah will regain its sovereignty, the whole 9 yards, so to speak. People in David's lineage would be reigning as king. Things would be back to normal. Well, within 2 full years. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And then in verse 4, I will bring again to this place Jeconiah. Now, Jeconiah was Jehoiachin, who was carried away into Babylonian captivity. He wasn't killed. And Hananiah, the false prophet, says, well, he's coming back. He's going to be restored to the throne. And I will bring again to this place Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, with all the captives of Judah that went into Babylon, saith the Lord, for I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. Now you see what kind of competition that Jeremiah the prophet had. And I suppose there were a lot of people that believed him. Why would they believe him? Why would they believe this false prophet? I mean, they wanted their sovereignty. right? So, the bottom line here is that false doctrine has more appeal to some people than pure doctrine. Why? Because typically false doctrine is soothing to the ears of the listeners. False doctrine is more in line with what many people wish would come to pass. We'll pick up there next week.